my name's Kedavon. Welcome or welcome back to my channel. I am starting the new year with a video about French literature because living in France, I do read a lot of French literature, partly planned, partly just because I come across a book and I'm like, well, it's French, I should probably like pick it up or read it or whatnot. And then also partly because most of my book clubs are in France and they're very much, in general, steering towards reading French books for obvious reasons. So what I'm going to do in this video is actually start with the books that I read last year and then kind of give you my little TBR of the French books I plan on reading this year. There's about like 20 to 25 of them in total. I didn't bother counting, but let's get started. So, and I actually ended the year literally on the dot reading French literature. So this year my big project was to read The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. I did not love it, just to preface this, but I was determined, absolutely determined not to let this thing carry into the new year. So I literally at 11:59, I finished this book. I was visiting my partner's family, and we were all just like sitting on the couch chilling. I wasn't obviously at like a big party or anything like that, but I was like squeaking this out till the very end because I really just did not enjoy it. But it is not a bad book. It's just, I think, not for me. Obviously, it's a classic, but it's serialized if you don't know. So that means Dumas originally published it's 117 chapters, as I know very well now. And those 117 chapters were published in a serialized, I believe, magazine or maybe newspaper. And so each week or whatever the time frame was, he would publish a chapter and he would get paid for that chapter. And I didn't bother to look up if he got paid by the word or by the chapter or by the line or the page or whatever, but basically he was paid more money the more he wrote. And it shows. It's 1,200 pages long in English. The French version's 2,000 pages. It is very long, and it's one of those books where I actually completely understand reading an abridged version because, I mean, a lot does happen. I wouldn't know where to cut, but it is a lot of extraneous detail, for sure. Yeah, I mean, we all know the story. It's a story about revenge. People say it's a great character study. I did not personally find it to be a great character study. We don't really even see his emotions or like his thought process aside from revenge, until like the last few chapters. I just think it's kind of like a soap opera in a book, basically. And I love soap operas. Soap operas can be fun. I don't need to read them though, so I'd rather watch a soap opera. I probably won't be picking up much by him anymore because I think that's how most of his works are. If I'm wrong about that, please correct me. But what I will say actually about this is part of the reason why it was such a slog to get through is because I did not listen to it on audiobook. I read the whole thing, not this actual physical copy because it's like gigantic. I don't even understand how people read hardcover copies. But this is because I wanted to read the Robin Buss translation, which is only this Penguin Black Classics edition. Robin Buss, I think, is one of the better modern French translators, and I've read a few of his translations and he's just really good, and so I read that his translation was the better of this work, and it's not available on audiobook, and I decided, you know what, I already knew I might not like this, so reading a bad translation was probably gonna make it even worse. Now that I'm like reflecting, maybe a slightly worse translation on audio would have made it a little less painful, but I don't know. I still recommend this translation. I thought it was really good. A lot of I tried reading an older translation because that's what it is. It's not on audio because it's newer, and the older translations are on audio because they're in the public domain. But they're just really not that good. I mean, I know people read them and like them, but I just, when I actually compared them side by side, I was like, oh no, this is not for me. So that's The Count of Monte Cristo. Glad I read it. Glad I'm done with it. So now I'm actually going to work backwards. The Count of Monte Cristo was the last book of the year, and now I'm going to start with the first book of the year, which was The Lady in the Little Fox Fur by Violette Leduc, and this one is translated by Coltman. And I think I've talked about this before. I think this was actually my very first YouTube video. I'll link it if it is. But basically it's a story about an older woman living in Paris, living in absolute poverty, and she just sort of like is very alone, has no human relationships, and it's very sad, but I really enjoyed it. Violette Leduc is a very well-known French lesbian author, and I definitely want to read more by her in the coming years. I don't have any other books of hers on my shelf, but I really enjoyed her writing. And then Bonjour, Tristesse, I actually read this twice because I read the, let's see, this is the Heather Lloyd translation, but first I read the something Ash, I'll write it up here if I can remember, and that is actually an edited version. they cut out a lot of it because it was too scandalous for the time period. So this is the more thorough and modern and better translation, which I recommend. Basically the story of a young girl going to vacation on the south of France with her father and her father's girlfriend. She causes trouble, and if you know French, Bonjour, Tristesse, hello, sadness. It has a very sad ending, and that's not a surprise, but I won't spoil it for you. Also really enjoyed that one. This one was picked up actually totally by surprise. I joined a book club last minute, and this was like the very next book they were reading, and it's relatively short, so I just picked it up and read it. It is The Princess de Clèves by Madame Lafayette, and this one also is translated by Robin Buss. Generally, if French books are in the Penguin Black Classics, it's Robin Buss, like maybe. But anyway, this is one of the first novels ever written, and it's also considered one of the first psychological novels. This was the first time, like one of the first examples of a work of literature getting into the mind of a character, which I didn't really quite understand, but now I'm reading the Swiss Family Robinson, and wow, do they really not get into the characters' heads. It's just like a constant description of what they're doing and nothing about their feelings, their emotions. And you think, like, you kind of take it for granted. You're like, okay, how could a novel not go into a character's feelings? They didn't until this kind of book sort of paved the way. So, and this is also the first example of historical fiction, because even though it was written in, I believe, the 1600s, set in the 1500s. Yeah, first published in 1678, but it is set in 15 something something. So yeah, for her writing, this was historical fiction, and the Princess de Clèves is the only fictional character, but all the other courtiers in the story are all real people. So she was sort of like talking about people that had been dead for 100 years, and it's actually quite good. I mean, it's definitely like an older book that's harder to get through, and there's lots of names that are really hard to keep track of, but in general it's a really interesting feminist story, so I really like that one. And then this one, I mean, I just picked it up used because this is a little collection, a bilingual collection of French poetry by New Directions. When I saw it, full price, this is like $16, and I don't know if you can like tell, it's like literally tiny, and it's not worth $16 for sure, but I bought it used for I think like $6, and that was fine. I didn't particularly enjoy the translations, not that I can make it like a huge expert on especially poetic translations, but I don't know, poetry's hard to translate. I'm not saying these are bad translations, I don't know, didn't really love this one, but it was nice to sort of practice French, I guess. And most of them are like older French poems, I believe. Yeah, most of them are older poems, so maybe that's also partially why. And then I read 2 French diaspora books. The Meursault investigation, I've talked about this a lot. It has its own video along with 2 of its books that it was inspired by. This is great. It's an Algerian book, sort of like exploring post-French colonization in Algeria. Really love this one. Highly recommend it. Check out the video. And it's by Kamel, Daoud, and it's translated by John Cullen. This one is from Republic of Congo, Memoirs of Porcupine, Alain Mabanckou. I read both of these actually for the Invisible Cities Challenge. Who translated this? Helen Stevenson. And this is also the sort of magical realism with a little porcupine as our narrator, who has been like bound to a man, given a potion to have like a sort of like an animal spirit who does his dirty work for him, and then the animal is sort of like explaining his master's life, and it's very funny and sad at the same time, and I really liked this one too. And then Mary Darrieussecq, Pigtails. This one's translated by Linda Coverdale. This is a wild ride. I can't really say I enjoyed it just because my face literally was like this the entire time. But it is interesting. It does make you think. Wild ride. Basically, a woman gets a job and she turns into a pig as she is dehumanized and sexualized and so on and so forth. And you'll think that's what makes it wild. That's just like the tip of the iceberg. Like, so much more happens. I don't even know how to explain it without spoiling it, so I'll just leave you to check out the video if you want or read it yourself. I will say I did enjoy it. I did enjoy the way it made me think. I did enjoy the way it sort of had me looking up for French cultural cues and context. Like, does this mean something in French culture that I'm not aware of? So that, in that sense, was a very like interesting thought experiment exercise. So on and so forth. Okay, then we have The Elegance of the Hedgehog, Muriel Barbery, and this one is translated by Alison Anderson, and this is a very classic style French novel, very like cerebral, very like psychological. I enjoyed it. I thought the ending was a bit of a cop-out, but you know, it was on purpose. Like, it was meant to mirror something, so I don't know. It's just like, you know, this is a very typical French style of novel. It's a sweet story. It's about a little girl who lives in an apartment building, and the gardien, like the what's it in English? Like the door lady or the concierge or something for the apartment building, and her sort of like have their own separate lives, and then they end up meeting, but they don't really meet until the very end, and I kind of was reading it more for their relationship, and they don't really have much of a relationship. So this was good. I enjoyed it. It's just not kind of how they market it, which is a shame, because I think if they marketed it the way it was written, it would be really good. So anyway. And then I think I'm gonna do, I already shot this and I didn't edit it or upload it yet, but I read 4 books by Annie Ernaux for November, which is hosted by Bob the Booker, and I'll probably post that right after this maybe, but I own a copy of The Years, Les Années by Annie Ernaux, and I read that for book club in November, and then I said, oh, why not just read the other 3 that he suggests, because the other 3 are very short. This one's more of a typical book size, like 250 pages. Oh, actually not even, it's like 220 pages. The other 3 are all less than 120, 50 pages, something like that. So they were all quick reads. I enjoyed them all. I'll talk more about them in that video, which I'll link after the fact, but I read The Happening, Exteriors, and Simple Passion. All excellent. I think all of them 5 stars, so yeah, definitely recommend. I'm sure you know, you're on book 2, but she won the Nobel Prize in November. And then last but not least, A Very French Christmas. What is the press? New Vessel Press. They do one of these volumes every year. I think they have like 7 now, but each year they do a very blank Christmas, and the first one I believe was a very Russian Christmas. This is the second one. I have the first 2, and then there's also, I think, German, Nordic, Italian, Irish, and then this year's was Mexican Christmas. So I plan on slowly making my way through these. These are not like feel good, like warm, cozy Christmas stories. They're definitely just like the stories of that are published in that country or by people from that country or in that language, that are just tangentially related to Christmas. So I think the biggest complaint that people have about this series is that it's like, oh, they were sad. And it's like, yeah, a lot of the times they are sad, but I really enjoyed them. Most of them are in the public domain and like very old, but there's 2 of them that were modern, and I think both of those authors have written other books for this press. So I think it's the press's way of sort of giving authors that they have a little bit more representation. But if you're like me and you don't think Christmas needs to be like 100% cheer central, and you can just, you know, you can be sad at Christmas and it's not like a tragedy, then these stories are quite interesting. Highly recommend this one. I haven't read the Russian one yet, and I'm looking forward to getting through the rest of the series, but the French one's definitely good, and it's available on audio, which is nice. Now, for the books that I don't have on my bookshelf, really quickly. Oh, Esther's Notebooks. I'll put it here. It's such a sweet graphic novel series. This graphic artist, graphic novel writer, a BD author, bande dessinée, he has a friend who has a daughter, and every year he interviews his daughter and she tells him all these wild stories about her year, and he puts it into a cute graphic novel. And the one I read last year was the first one. I'll probably continue reading them in French, but really there's at least the first one in English, and I highly recommend you check it out. It's by Pushkin Press. Is so nice. Like, I really enjoyed it. Like, everyone in France like loves them, and I was just kind of like, oh, it's a little overhyped, I probably won't love them. I love them. It's so cute, like so adorable, so honest, because she's anonymous, so she can kind of just say what she wants to say, and there's no shame, there's no embarrassment, so that's really cool. And the next one I read, Consent, a memoir by Vanessa Springora. That I've definitely spoken about that in a video, but it's basically a memoir about the sexual abuse a young woman faced back in the 80s. France is not the panacea of sexual freedom as they pretend to be, so definitely check that one out if you're interested in reading about sexual violence or you know, power, things like that in relationships. So okay, so this that was all the books I read last year, French literature, and this year I have my French reading plans. There's 8 books here on my stack, and of course I'll probably read more from the library and things like that, but this is what I have on my actual bookshelf. So as a reward for finishing The Count of Monte Cristo, I bought all 3 volumes of Jules Verne, Around the World in 80 Days, Journey to the Center of the Earth, and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So these are actually out of print, the Oxford World Classics. Here, I'll hold them up one at a time. This one, and this one. They're out of print, so I like had quite a fun time getting a hold of these, but again, I chose them because I chose them for the translation. So I think the translation is very important for enjoying especially older French literature. I like to do quite a bit of research about the translators, because a lot of especially older French texts, if you enjoy them, that's great, like the old translations, that's awesome. If there's more than one translation to choose from, that generally means it's older, and the first one probably isn't the best one, and the first one is probably the cheaper one or the free one. So it does suck, but I think it is worth investing. And again, these are not available in audio, so I will be reading them hard copy, which I don't love, especially when there is an audio version. Like, oh, it's right there, I could listen to it, but like, I really want to have a good translation, so I'm prioritizing. All right, so that's Jules Verne. Those I'll probably spread out throughout the year, not like binge them or anything. But then I have also The Plague by Camus. Again, this has 3 translations, and I think I want to read all 3 just because he is a pretty modern writer, so like there's not probably a huge difference in terms of like the first one being terrible just because it's so old and archaic. Or edited for puritanical reasons, but this is the one I decided to start with because it's Robin Buss, and since I do want to be able to say I've read most of his translations. But then there is a more modern one that was just released when I purchased this one, and I definitely want to read that one as well. So I don't remember that translator's name, but yeah, so I want to start with this one. And like, I don't know why, but during COVID I had zero motivation to read something like this, but now I definitely do want to read it just because I think it'd be interesting. But I think most people might have read this like 2 years ago. Okay, and then sticking to classics, more classic, 93 by Victor Hugo. I actually received this as a gift from my partner. This is his favorite book. He's French, and not gonna lie, the description is not getting me excited, but I will definitely read it because it's his favorite, and this is on audio, so yay. I'll read you the description, it's short. Fighting between the newly formed French Republic and bands of royalists has torn the countryside apart. Alongside the coast of Brittany, a formidable force led by the Marquis de Lantenac is starting to make gains against the Blues. The Bleu. Okay. Threatening the revolution itself. Sent by Danton and Robespierre, Gauvin must defeat Lantenac, a distant relative. It's a war book. It's a war book. But, you know, it's Victor Hugo, so it's not like, you know, it is definitely about war. So I've been reading quite a bit about war. Speaking of war, another more modern one that I started last year but I didn't quite finish, and I'm probably just going to restart it because it's so short, is At Night All Blood is Black by David Diop, and this is translated by Anna Moshevakis. Is that how you say it? I don't know. Always correct me if I'm saying something wrong in comments for sure. But this is a Senegalese author writing about a war experience from Senegalese soldiers in World War I. I've read about like I think a third of it and I really enjoyed it. I just put it down and I don't exactly remember what happened, so I'm going to start over, but also a war book. Probably will read this first before the other war book, but we'll see. So yeah, that's At Night All Blood is Black. And then The Diving Bell and the Butterfly by Jean-Dominique Bobby, and this one is translated by Jeremy Legat. Or Legat, there's 2 T's, I'm not sure. But this one is, I was intrigued by this one, and I found it used in Amsterdam, I believe. And this is written by a man who had locked-in syndrome. So locked-in syndrome is when you can move absolutely nothing but your eyes. So you have to like blink out letter by letter to communicate, essentially. Ironically, actually, that's what a character in the Count of Monte Cristo had. Anyway. Just like a theme that French people love to play with. I don't know, but anyway, no, this is a real life person who had it. And he was like an editor of a magazine, and then he was, I don't know, got sick or had a stroke, yeah, and then basically had locked-in syndrome and wrote this whole book by blinking it out with his eyeballs. So he's pretty like misogynistic, like as a person, but it is kind of cool. To write a whole book like by blinking it out. So I definitely do want to read through it and just, I don't know, like it just seems interesting. Not super excited by it or anything, but the premise is really intriguing to me, so that's why I picked it up. And last but not least, I'll make another video about this, but Françoise Sagan's Bonjour, Tristesse also going to be making a reappearance this year. I read it twice last year, gonna read it again this year, but this time in the French. So I bought this specifically to read it in the French, and it didn't happen. This was my goal last year, to read this book in French. So I'm gonna actually make another video about my experience, my journey reading in French, because this was, I think I've been biting off more than I can chew, and I've taken a step back and started more basic and kind of like worked my way up, and I think that's the way I'm gonna continue. So, but I think by summertime I'll be ready to read this, and I'm really looking forward to it because I think probably all literature, I have no idea because I don't speak any of the other languages, but really I think French writing is just so much more beautiful in French, specifically because most French like rules and like pronunciation rules in French are really dictated by how pretty it sounds. Like it's funny because that's like a lot of times like really hard to like get your head around, but like the rule literally is like what sounds prettier, say it that way. So that's why I really want to start reading in French, and I think this one will be so much prettier in French. So that's my goal for this year. Alrighty, so that's all the French literature I've been reading lately. Definitely, if you have read any of these, let me know what you think, especially for the ones that I haven't read yet. And if you have any recommendations, I'm always looking for more French literature to read. Of course, there are the classics, but more like modern or, you know, gems, hidden gems, those are definitely ones I'm always looking for. So if you have any recommendations, as always, please let me know. And until next time, bye!